afternoon and welcome to Conversations on Leadership with our guests, Frank Schaeffer, New York Times bestselling author of more than a dozen fiction and nonfiction books, and Amanda Tyler, Executive Director of BJC, Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty in Washington, D.C. I am Dorothy Burton, your host, President of Christians in Public Service. Christians in Public Service was founded in 2013 to reach, teach, and minister to the unique needs of leaders in touch-point capacities that have the most immediate and hands-on impact in our communities, cities, and counties. SIPS is a 501c3 nonprofit, strictly nonpartisan, not religious, not political, but Christ-centered. Our mission is connecting God's Word with our works so that our works reflect God's Word. Frank, Amanda, a big Texas welcome. We are glad to have you join us today to discuss these very important topics. We're going to get right to it. I have asked Frank, as one of the founders of the evangelical movement, along with his father, evangelical legendary Francis Schaeffer, to talk to us about the history and impact of conservative evangelicalism and help us make some sense of the religious right in government today. Amanda will talk to us about Christian nationalism, defining for us what that means. We see it, especially here in Texas, but if you're like me, you didn't know what it was or what it is. Christian nationalism in Texas is ground zero for sure in its influence on public policy, but such is the case around the country. If you have comments and questions you'd like to ask at the end of our presentations today, please post them and Stephen will collect them and we will get as many answered as we can. Our speakers may post links for you in the chat, and this presentation will be recorded for future viewing and to share. We will begin with Frank Schaeffer, and then we will segue to Amanda. Each of them are going to have 15 minutes to talk to you, Frank about evangelicalism, Amanda about Christian nationalism, these very important topics, and then I will be back and we will be back to discuss. To introduce Frank Schaeffer is a New York Times bestselling author of more than a dozen fiction and nonfiction books, including Crazy for God and Keeping Faith, a father-son story about love in the United States Marine Corps. His new book, Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy, will be available on November 2nd, and if you would pre-order this book on Amazon, it is available for that. Frank is a survivor of both polio and an evangelical fundamentalist childhood, an acclaimed writer who overcame severe dyslexia, a homeschooled and self-taught documentary movie director, a feature film director of 4 low-budget Hollywood features Frank has described as pretty terrible. He is also an acclaimed author of fiction and nonfiction and an artist with a loyal following of international collectors who own many of his paintings. Frank has been a frequent guest on The Rachel Maddow Show on NBC, has appeared on Oprah, been interviewed by Terry Gross of NPR's Fresh Air, and appeared on The Today Show, BBC News, and many other media outlets. He is a much sought-after speaker and has lectured at a wide range of venues, from Harvard's Kennedy School to the Hammer Museum, UCLA, Princeton University, Riverside Church Cathedral, DePaul University, and the Kansas City Public Library. Please join me in welcoming Frank Schaeffer.
Hi, Dorothy. Thank you so much for having me on. And Amanda, it's a great honor to be on with you. I kind of wish you went first. It's always tough to be up first, but such is the luck of the draw. You know, Dorothy, you were mentioning in my background that I'm the survivor of an evangelical fundamentalist background. And I have to say, having written a memoir a few years ago that you and I were talking about before we went here on our show called Crazy for God, where I described my journey out of the evangelical far right and what it was like growing up in a missionary family that then became very famous in the evangelical movement. it kind of sets up today's discussion in terms of both separation of church and state, religious liberty, and white nationalism, which is really overtaking the evangelical movement in the era of Trump and after Trump. And so when we look at the situation we're in the United States, when it comes to a lot of issues confronting us, you have to understand that very much like, say, Saudi Arabia, with the Wahhabist extremists who have been part of the movement there for a long time, or Hindu nationalist India with Prime Minister Modi that have gone far to the right in terms of Hindu nationalism, or Poland with its conservative Roman Catholicism now pushing to the right, or Hungary. The US is not in a unique position when it comes to white evangelical involvement in politics. In fact, back in the 1960s and 70s, when I was a young man, if you would ask people at that period of time, hey, fast forward to the 2020s, what sort of world will it be? I'll bet you that almost all of them, evangelical Christians, Roman Catholics, anyone, atheists, agnostics, would have agreed on one thing. We are moving in a secularizing direction, and we are moving away from evangelical fundamentalism or Hindu fundamentalism or Wahhabist fundamentalism of the Saudi stripe. They would not have envisioned that. And when they think about, say, a theocracy, they would think about Iran and the takeover by the Ayatollah Khomeini, for instance. They would never picture that in Western democracies right now, there would be a pitched battle between those who support democracy and those who really seem to be working for an agenda of theocracy. So what are some examples of that? Well, Amy Coney Barrett, who's on the Supreme Court, who was appointed because the right wing of the Republican Party and the evangelicals like Ralph Reed and others pushed her there, is now part of a majority on the court that, for instance, exempted evangelical churches and other churches from having to not meet during the COVID shutdowns based on religious freedom. In other words, religious freedom to the modern American right-wing Supreme Court trumps public health. And you see other examples of this, for instance, in the abortion ruling in Texas, where people can rat out someone else and sue them privately if they know they're going to have an abortion, a kind of a legalized vigilantism that sounds more like a lynch mob than it does anything to do with the law. And then the Supreme Court remains silent on that. Or all the cases where, for instance, the Supreme Court has more recently spoken out when it comes to contraception, where they have said that if a company like Hobby Lobby does not want to have insurance policies that give women contraception as part of their policy, they can opt out on the basis of religious freedom. And now, right now, you have people seeking, quote, religious exemptions to even getting a vaccination or vaccine mandates or mask wearing. So what you see now is something very different than when I grew up in the evangelical community back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, when my father, Francis Schaeffer, became a evangelical leader with a worldwide following and millions of book sales, and was staying in the White House with President Ford, for instance. President Ford's son was staying in our house. Mike Ford stayed with us a year. In fact, Gail, his wife, used to babysit my daughter, Jessica, and we had these close connections. Back in those days, the Republican Party was still sort of a normal political party. In other words, it was to the right, it was conservative, it talked about family values, it was all these other issues, it was fiscally responsible. They thought the Democrats were too far to the left and too irresponsible on financing what they viewed as socialist programs, but they were all reading from the same page of facts. Fast forward 30 or 40 years and you realize that the Republican Party is now part of the evangelical movement, not the other way around. And that is that the agenda of people like Ralph Reed and what used to be the moral majority started by Jerry Falwell, the people who sort of followed him later, actually run the show. They made Donald Trump president. Without the white evangelical vote, he wouldn't be president. You can take Vladimir Putin out of the picture and you can take all sorts of things out. But if you take the evangelical voter, the white nationalist evangelical voter out of the mix, you don't even have a Republican Party today. And so you see catering to these folks' views in examples such as, for instance, Donald Trump moving the embassy of the United States from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, not even at the demand of the Israelis, but at the demand of people in the US who consider themselves evangelical Christian Zionists, not because they love Jews, they don't, not because they love Israel, they don't, but they see it as part of the eschatology of fulfillment, that Jesus can't come back until greater Israel expands its borders and fulfills prophecy as they happen to read their Bibles. So, if you had asked me a few years before Donald Trump came along whether something like the Trump era would be possible, I would have said no. If you had asked me 20 years ago, will there be a time when the battle in the U.S. is no longer between Republicans, Democrats, right and left, but between a bunch of people who run the Republican Party now, who view America as a potential theocracy in which we will return to God's law or America's Christian foundation, as they falsely claim, and democracy, I wouldn't have believed you. But now that you have a whole group of evangelicals hanging on to the idea that the last election was stolen, that Joe Biden is not really president, that Donald Trump is still somehow president because he was God's chosen one, we're in a new era. So sometimes my secular friends on the left will ask me questions, for instance, Rachel Maddow when she interviews me, or folks like that, and say, how can the evangelicals have followed Trump? And I have to explain to them that they have made it a matter of faith. In other words, when you challenge Trump now, it's no longer about politics. It would be like challenging the virgin birth or the resurrection of Jesus or the reality of the miracles and the walking on water. It's an element of faith. This is a man who they believe was chosen by God. And so reason and facts and poll numbers, none of these things apply. And nor apparently does even a legal, fair election, where every Republican official in every state has upheld the veracity of the election, except right-wing Republican politicians catering to the evangelical far right, this new group of people, these theocrats, and pretending, like Ted Cruz does, that he thought the election was stolen, when he knows perfectly well it wasn't. So my family was very formative in the religious right because of the abortion issue. And something that a lot of your viewers and listeners may not know is that when we went with a movie series made with Dr. C. Everett Koop, who was then Surgeon General of the United States, or rather soon would be under Ronald Reagan, that was against abortion and the legalization of abortion through Roe v. Wade, our big argument was not with the secular world, the National Organization of Women, and all those sorts of folks. It was with pro-choice, listen to me, pro-choice evangelical leaders. Like who? Dr. Reverend Billy Graham, the evangelist, was pro-choice. We met with him 3 times at Mayo Clinic, where my dad was undergoing cancer chemotherapy treatments, and Billy came for numerous checkups and begged him to join our anti-abortion crusade. He would not. He said, I can't do that as a Christian that preaches the love of Jesus. I believe in choice. Dr. Criswell, president of the Southern Baptist Convention, pastor of First Dallas Baptist Church, First Baptist in Dallas, and president of Baptist Theological Seminary, not only pro-choice, actually wrote on the subject, citing Bible verses to show that he didn't believe that human life started at conception. The editorial board of Christianity Today magazine, the same thing. So our first big argument was to convince pro-choice or ambivalent evangelicals that abortion was even an issue. We've gone from there to today, where it is a litmus test accepted along with the virgin birth as somehow part and parcel of Christianity. And so there has been a huge change that a lot of evangelicals are not aware of. And of course, the other big shoe to drop is white nationalism. And so I want to remind people listening that who may think that I'm anti-evangelical. I'm not. I'm calling evangelicals back to a time, for instance, when there would have been no abolitionist movement without evangelical Christian leadership. There would have been no movement against child labor without evangelical Christian leadership. There are points in American history where what we would now call progressives or the left were evangelicals. And of course, the Southern Baptists broke away from the Baptist community so they could defend slavery. Sure. But there were just as many evangelicals on the other side who were abolitionists. And it's been the same with every era of American history until now, when evangelicalism is totally identified with not just right-wing politics, but an extremist Republican Party that no longer reflects even the will of the American people. For instance, on wearing face masks, for instance, on getting the vaccine, for instance, on vaccine mandates, for instance, on the fact that we don't want religion and public life mixed together to the point where someone like the Supreme Court can come along and exempt Christians or exempt any religious group from regular, ordinary, common decency and healthcare policies, like wearing a mask or not meeting publicly when you have an epidemic, in the name of religious freedom. So I just want to conclude before we start listening to Amanda talk to us, and then we'll be discussing with Amanda afterward, with this. Like a frog being boiled, where you turn it up a few degrees every hour in an experiment, the frog never jumps out of the water because the frog never realizes they're being boiled to death. Evangelicals don't understand, I don't think, that they have shifted from being a group of people who are about freedom, tolerance, the love of Jesus, care for the neighbor, the Good Samaritan, and all these other things that we associate with historical Christianity, whether it's Florence Nightingale or the abolitionist movement or Dr. Martin Luther King or whomever it may be, to becoming a white nationalist party now infused with racism, reactionary thinking, and worst of all, an anti-democracy movement within the Republican Party that says, look, we don't care about fair and free elections. We're going to start voter suppression. We're going to start gerrymandering. We're going to question election results and even put the entire democracy up for grabs in order to prosecute our agenda. And that agenda is right-wing Christian nationalism. And it is a new thing in American culture. There have always been crazies on the fringe. There have always been these militia groups or nutcases saying this and that. But as I know, because I knew Billy Graham, and I was part and parcel of the rise of the religious right, even we in those days in the 70s and 80s, when we were making, for instance, abortion an issue, never could have imagined this day. And my father, were he alive today, I can literally say this, and anybody who knew him would know this is true, would have literally thrown up at the idea that there were Christians storming the Capitol in the name of Jesus to support a con artist like Donald Trump and his claim that the election had been stolen when it hadn't been. This is not Christianity. It is not evangelicalism. It is not the light that Christianity has often been to the United States. And my point of view is to be heartbroken at this, even though I have journeyed away from the evangelical community. At this point, it's not even a religious group anymore. It is a conspiracy theory-based cult of white nationalism, and it has changed. And so that's all I want to say at this point. And over to you, Amanda Tyler.
Let me introduce. Can you hear me? Let me introduce. I want to make a point, Frank. 2 points, and we're gonna segue to Amanda. Criswell, in his book, in Randall Balmer's book, you interviewed him on a podcast.
Yes, I interviewed Randall Balmer.
On Bad Faith. He quotes Criswell, who at the time, Criswell was the president of not Dallas Theological Seminary, but Criswell College. And in his book, he quotes Criswell as saying that very same thing, that he could not support abortion. And he calls it the abortion myth. And you are exactly right. It did not start out as abortion, actually, and you didn't say it. But in his book, he says it actually started out as segregation didn't fly. So they had to find something. What was his name?
Paul Weyrich.
Yes, he had to find something that would fly. That didn't fly, but abortion did. Now I'm going to introduce Amanda, and this is gonna put another piece of the puzzle together. Amanda Tyler is the executive director. Thank you, Frank. We're going to come back. Amanda Tyler is the executive director of BJC, Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty in Washington, D.C. She leads the organization as it upholds the historic Baptist principle of religious liberty, defending the free exercise of religion and protecting against its establishment by government. Amanda often speaks in churches, educational institutions, and denominational gatherings. And she provides commentary on faith freedom issues to the national media. She also co-hosts the Respecting Religion series on the BJC podcast, and she serves on the board of the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation. Amanda was named Baptist of the Year by ethicsdaily.com in 2019 for her work leading the Christians Against Christian Nationalism initiative. Called a powerful advocate and rising star in the sector by the nonprofit Times, she was named one of the nation's top 50 nonprofit leaders in 2018. Amanda is a graduate of Georgetown University and the University of Texas School of Law. A member of the Texas and U.S. Supreme Court Bar, she has experience working in Congress, in private practice, and serving as a law clerk for a federal judge. You can follow Amanda on Twitter at Amanda Tyler BJC. Join me in welcoming Amanda Tyler.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Dorothy, and thank you, Frank, for setting the stage so well. I am going to share a PowerPoint now and kind of walk us through Christian nationalism and maybe how this helps us understand the topic that Frank has laid out, and I really look forward to our exchange in just a few minutes. So just a little bit of information about BJC. Hope that you will learn more about BJC and follow us on our social media channels and subscribe to get our emails as well. I think it's really important when we're talking about, let me see if I can, there we go, about Christian nationalism to be clear about what we're talking about. And here's a definition: a political ideology and cultural framework that seeks to merge our identities as Americans and Christians. It's important to point out that it's not a religion, but a political ideology. It is not new. In my work looking at Christian nationalism, we can date it back to the very forming of the country, even in the colonies, but certainly to that first generation after the Constitution is where historians really see the foothold of Christian nationalism taking hold. Some of the markers of Christian nationalism, a mythical history that really sees America as a quote-unquote Christian nation, one created by God to serve Christians, to further the Christian faith. One way to see it is an exaggerated form of American exceptionalism, and it really has an emphasis on God's providential hand in American history and in our present day politics. These are some of the ways you can recognize Christian nationalism. You know, Christian nationalism is not Christianity. It is a political ideology. It is a cultural framework, a collection of myths and traditions, symbols, narratives, value systems. It's really more about identity, the Christian part of it in Christian nationalism, than religion. But we can't divorce it entirely from Christianity. It uses the language and symbols of Christianity. And as Frank was talking about, I think we see a lot of times all kinds of religious people choosing Christian nationalism over Christianity. So sometimes what we see coming out of religious sectors is really more like Christian nationalism than what we think of as Orthodox Christianity in some way. We at Christians Against Christian Nationalism, working with some of the sociologists who are really experts in this field, Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, have put together a document called a one-pager called What is Christian Nationalism? And I would really recommend that to everyone to understand some of these identity markers. That when we talk about Christian nationalism, it comes with it assumptions about nativism, white supremacy, authoritarianism, patriarchy, and militarism. And so it's really important that we think about all of those being packed into Christian nationalism. We also can't forget that Christian nationalism has so much overlap and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. And so much so that sometimes I will use the terms white Christian nationalism and Christian nationalism interchangeably in this way. And why is that? Well, you know, when Christian nationalism relies so heavily on this history, part of American history, a huge part of American history, is a history that is steeped in slavery and in white supremacy and segregation. And so to, I think, mythologize and idealize this founding without recognizing the interplay with slavery and with segregation and other types of discrimination really provides cover for this racial subjugation. Christian nationalism also operates a lot like racism. It's pervasive in our society. It touches almost every aspect of our culture. And so when I talk about Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism, I talk about it as an ideology. I think it's much more helpful to talk about that and how it impacts all of us, rather than trying to single out or name certain people as Christian nationalists. Just like we all live in a racist society and a society that's tinged by racism, that's much more helpful than trying to name or call out certain people as racists. And so there are a lot of overlap here. well, how does this Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism show up? Frank mentioned the Christian nationalism that was on display at the Capitol on January 6th, at the Capitol insurrection. There were some other, really horrifically violent examples of Christian nationalism. I would point to the Tree of Life synagogue shooting in October of 2018. Also, the shooting at Mother Emanuel AME Church in June of 2015. These are examples of violent Christian nationalism, that Christian nationalism in the hands of violent extremists can turn deadly, as it did on those occasions. And these are the kinds of examples that really draw Christian nationalism to our attention. But I think that we do a disservice to Christian nationalism to only concentrate on these examples. So here's another example. This is a public school wall in South Dakota. And in South Dakota, there was a law passed, and this was a law that was passed in a lot of different places in the country, that required the posting of "In God We Trust" on every public school classroom. It's right out of something called the Project Blitz playbook. And the organizers of Project Blitz wanted to, and I'm reading straight from their legislative playbook, solidify the foundation set by the founding fathers who established this nation on the belief that we have certain inalienable rights that are endowed by our Creator. More than just a motto, it's our country's foundation and an important part of our identity as Americans. And that this posting is an acknowledgement that of God's role in our history and our founding principles. And so here's an example of indoctrinating our public school children into this ideology of Christian nationalism. Another example, very recent from the Texas legislature, there is currently a resolution pending that would make the Bible the official book of the state of Texas. Another example of this kind of cultural Christian nationalism that sends an implicit message that you only belong here if you ascribe to this certain religion, and that's part of your identity, that's part of your civic identity. Here's another example of Christian nationalism. This is a 40-foot cross that stands in Bladensburg, Maryland, only about 10 miles from where I am right now in Washington, D.C. It's in government land. It has been maintained by the government for decades. And the constitutionality of this cross came to the U.S. Supreme Court just a few years ago. And it was whether the court was determining whether this was a violation of the First Amendment's No Establishment Clause. It says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. I use it, the particulars of the case were very specific to this particular cross, and really relying on its history and on the divisiveness that would take to actually take down this cross. The Supreme Court let this particular monument stand. But I use it as an example of Christian nationalism because this community erected this cross as a sign of patriotism, to honor the local veterans who had died in World War I. But in their zeal to keep this cross up on government land, the government and those who were defending this cross, the U.S. government, was arguing that this cross was not a Christian symbol. That no, this cross was a generic symbol of sacrifice. And BJC filed a brief at the U.S. Supreme Court to, of all things, defend the Christian nature of the cross, to say that you can't appropriate our most central symbol of Christianity and call it a generic symbol of sacrifice that could stand for all people. And so this is one of the dangers of Christian nationalism, that to appropriate one's religion for the government's sake will strip religion of its central meaning and of its power and try to appropriate it for government means. One last example of Christian nationalism comes straight out of many sanctuaries, which would place the American flag and here the Christian flag on the altar, really calling into question who exactly or what exactly are we here to worship during this time. what does our worship of God have to do with our patriotism? The Christian flag is a whole nother, conversation, something I'm learning quite a bit about, because there is actually, the U.S. Supreme Court is deciding a case this term from the city of Boston, not far from Frank, about whether the city of Boston has to fly the Christian flag if a group asks to fly the Christian flag. And the group that's asking to fly the Christian flag, by the way, is a group called Camp Constitution that has a lot of Christian nationalist ideas that they're propagating. But I use this example here to show how Christian nationalism can happen, not just in government spaces, not just in public spaces, but also in religious spaces as well. So all of this work about Christian nationalism led BJC now over 2 years ago to help organize an ecumenical response called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And you can learn more on the website christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. Part of our desire to do this was to really have a unifying example of how Christians, even though we might differ in our theology and our approach on a number of moral and social issues, that we can be united in defending Christianity against Christian nationalism and calling out how it infects our faith and how it also tears at the fabric of American society. And in the centerpiece of this Christians Against Christian Nationalism is a statement. And in the statement, we have 8 principles of things that we are for. And all of these principles are really restatements of religious freedom for all, basic principles of what it means to live in a pluralistic society that stands up for everyone's religious freedom. And so I want to walk through here, just to close, some of the statements that we might hear in our society that are really infused with Christian nationalism. And these can come not just from, really conservative evangelical circles. These can come from all different parts of our society, and ways that the statement Christians Against Christian Nationalism can help provide a response to them. And all of these, except for one, which you will see when I get there, are not actual quotes from people, but things that you might hear. So you'll see quotes, but these are not things that I can attribute, except for one example. So my first statement here is, secular leftists just want to label everyone a Christian nationalist to strip God, Jesus, and religion out of the public square. In truth, I'm hearing a version of this more and more since January 6th, when there's a lot more attention on Christian nationalism, that people really take an affront to us even calling out Christian nationalism. And I can point them straight back to the Christians Against Christian Nationalism statement. Our very first principle is that people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. This really rebuts one of the key misunderstandings about separation of church and state. That was never meant to remove religion from the public square. And in fact, I think Christians have a particular responsibility to speak up against Christian nationalism. And while we all have this right and responsibility, this particular campaign, this movement, is needed because some who have spoken for Christians have exacerbated the problem of Christian nationalism. So we're not calling any names, but we do think it's really important for people of all faiths to be able to engage in the public square. Also hear a version of this. I'm not a nationalist. I'm just a patriot who loves God and who loves my country. What's wrong with being patriotic? And, our statement says that our patriotism does not require us to minimize our religious convictions. One can be patriotic and show that love of country in so many different ways, waving a flag, but also standing up for our religious convictions, even when they're at odds with the government. And so, some Christians are feeling called to take a stand against racism by taking a knee during the national anthem, right? That to do so is I believe, a patriotic move, but it also, if we're speaking from our religious convictions, if our patriotism ever asks us to sacrifice one of our religious convictions, it's no longer patriotism, it's nationalism. And so we need to watch out for those examples where we're being asked to minimize our love of Jesus for our love of country. Here's another one. The United States is a Christian nation, always has been, and God willing, always will be. And it's important that our leaders reflect our Christian values. And here, our statement says, one's religious affiliation or lack thereof should be irrelevant to one's service in the civic community. And this is really just a restatement of Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution that says there shall be no religious test for public office. So our citizenship was never contingent upon our religious belief, and it's really important that we reflect that when answering that charge of a Christian nation. Most of the people in the United States are Christian. Why wouldn't we want our government and elected officials to promote and protect our faith? And our answer is, government should not prefer one religion over another or religion over non-religion. And this is just really a restatement of the First Amendment, that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It is not government's job to do the job of religion. And even if we are in the majority, it will do more harm than good for the government to promote our religion. I'm sure this is a familiar one, that everything went downhill in the 1960s when they took God out of the public schools and told our children they couldn't pray anymore. There's a lot going on in this statement here, but I think one way to answer this is in the Christians Against Christian Nationalism statement that religious instruction is best left to our houses of worship, other religious institutions, and families. That's not the job of the government to teach our children religion. Here's the only statement that's attributed. This was then Donald Trump's campaign manager when he said, "Only God could deliver such a savior to our nation, and only God could allow me to help. God bless America." This really sent off red flags for me, equating Donald Trump with a savior. And our statement was not answering this particular tweet, but I think really answers this tendency that conflating religious authority with political authority is idolatrous and often leads to the oppression of minority and other marginalized groups, as well as the spiritual impoverishment of religion. For my podcast series on the BJC podcast on the dangers of Christian nationalism, I talked to theologian Walter Brueggemann, and he just talked about how power, that those in power really want our religion to have a very anemic God, that it's easier to control a religion that can be put into political terms. And so we as Christians really want to resist that. So I'm going to end it there and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda and Frank. And I want to say this, as I was reading through a book that I recommend, Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States by Andrew Whitehead and Samuel L. Perry. It was a very eye-opener for me, because my background, as far as you heard their two backgrounds, my background is I'm an anomaly in Texas in that I've been a conservative Republican all of my life. When I couldn't wait to vote. The first person I voted for was Ronald Reagan, and I voted for every Republican president, governor, official since, unless they were friends of mine. If they were Democrat, I'd kind of cringe and vote Democrat, but I never could understand the Democrat, the left side. I voted for Donald Trump in 2016. So when I read that book, it was like I was horrified, because I said to myself, I was a Christian nationalist and I didn't even know it. It was a pride that I took in being American, conflating spirituality with nationality. And one of the things in the book that stuck out with me, Amanda and Frank both, is that the blurring our Christian identity. Stevens came up. Our Christian identity with our American identity, because it's just not only white people or white evangelicals that are Christian nationalists. There are a number of African Americans and Hispanics that are Christian nationalists. And it has to do with love of country, the military, Christianity, and it's all rolled up into one. But now it seems, Amanda and Frank, that there is a hybrid kind of monster that has grown from this. And it's not about religion, it's not about Christianity, but it's about power. And Frank, you made a very poignant statement when you said that the GOP, let me see if I got it right, the GOP is now part of the evangelical movement, not the other way around. It's a very complicated issue, and it would be easy to say that, oh, it's just white people, or it's just white evangelicals, but it's deeper than that. Either one of you want to speak to that?
Well, you mentioned my name, and Amanda's been talking, so I'll jump in here. It was interesting when I interviewed Representative Ted Lieu of California, who I guess is the third most senior person in Congress right now. I've talked to Ted a couple of times in the past, and he comes from a Roman Catholic background, is a practicing Roman Catholic, and we talk about this. And I was mentioning to Ted that one of my concerns for the Democratic Party is to underestimate the fact that so many of the folks who come from the Hispanic community who are coming to the States in various statuses, immigration, or have already been here for a long time, come from very fundamentalist, evangelical / Pentecostal type churches and or conservative Roman Catholic churches. And that I think a lot of more progressive people who are worried about Christian nationalism and these other issues that Amanda and I are talking about underestimate the fact that when evangelical white organizations or individuals or pastors or evangelical black organizations and pastors who are on the right, as you were talking about, Dorothy, or at least are into the Christian nationalist framework, reach out to them, that of course they speak the language of morality and Christianity to numbers of Hispanics who are coming in and pastors and otherwise. When you look at the Hispanic vote, for instance, in sections of Florida in the last election that went for Donald Trump, the idea that just because he called them rapists and criminals and insulted them and closed the border and put kids in cages, that somehow this documentary evidence of his own bigotry was enough to guarantee the future Democratic victory as America becomes more brown and more black and more Hispanic is really, I think, foolish. Until we address the issue of Christian nationalism, as you are today, Dorothy, that cuts across racial, gender, and economic divide and really unites a whole group of people who somehow see patriotism, the flag, America, the military, all mixed up as one thing and think they are defending it against godless secularism and all the rest of us. We need to address that. So I just commend you for bringing that point up. And I would say it bears out something that I've been thinking about and talking to a number of political leaders about. I just wonder what Amanda wants to contribute on that or whether we should move on.
Yeah, and I'm glad, Dorothy, that you brought up the Taking America Back for God book. So, we've been coordinating with Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry and Christians Against Christian Nationalism. Their work is really influential in the way we talk about it. And when they talk about Christian nationalism, again, they have studied, with their research methods and surveyed and done a lot of individual interviews, and they talk about a range of Christian nationalism. It's an ideology, so they are able to place people from on one end of the spectrum, people who totally reject Christian nationalism, to the other end were people who are ambassadors for Christian nationalism. And in the middle, there are resistors and there are accommodators. And their research shows that there are those who completely reject it, and there are those who are ambassadors for it. But the majority of the American population is in the middle. They're either resisting it or they're accommodating it. And so understanding that, again, not pointing fingers, that it's only in one group, I think is really important to dismantling it. And so part of this, if it's so pervasive, if it's across our culture, if it's in every circle, first we have to put a name to it. And I think that's the work that we've we, and I mean that very generously, there's a big group of people who are talking about Christian nationalism now, are trying to put a name to this, to show examples of it, some of which I showed here today, but so people can start to recognize it, and again, recognize it in themselves and in their own communities, sometimes even in their own sanctuary, if they start to think and start to question, I think some of these assumptions that have gone unquestioned for so long, just to start to kind of unravel that a bit in a way that is not, not overly aggressive. I think it's done by conversation. That's what our tool, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, to try to offer a statement, a place of learning. We have a 3-part curriculum that we released this summer that can help congregations have really honest and candid and generous conversations about this, just to start to kind of unravel it. I mean, I think that's how we're going to start to get at the problem. People often ask about, well, what about, conservative evangelicals? I think Whitehead and Perry's research show that percentage-wise, there are more ambassadors in conservative evangelical circles than in some other circles of Christian nationalism, but also because of the political power that particular voting bloc has garnered in recent years, that we're seeing more instances of Christian nationalism from that group showing up in our daily life. But it doesn't mean that Christian nationalism isn't really pervasive throughout the culture.
That is
sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead,
Dorothy.
Frank. No. Go ahead, Frank.
I was just going to jump in with one thing and say, I forget whether it was you, Dorothy, or Amanda, or me who said this. I'm just sort of in the conversation. But one of us brought up the fact a few minutes ago that Christian nationalism involved, sort of thinking that loyalty depended on consolidating our support for the military, the flag, for all these things. And I want to throw one other thing in there. I just want to make 2 points, and I'll be brief and then get back into the flow. The first thing is that I think that Christian nationalism also sells itself as a kind of repository and defender of what I call fake family values. And that is, if you love your children, if you love your family, if you want them protected from predators, if you don't want them turning into what they would call sexual deviants. This goes way back to people trying to change the law so they would forbid people to teach if they were gay. You have In God We Trust on a schoolroom wall. So I don't think you can get away from the emotional appeal to parents and grandparents and other people who say, hey, these bad people who are trying to pull you away from God and America away from God, they're after your kids. They're going to subvert that. So first of all, fake family values is a big thing. And then the second thing I would say, in addition to that, when it comes to support for the military, is my son served in Afghanistan as a Marine. And he volunteered in 1999. And after 9/11, he went over as enlisted. He was there, 2 tours of duty there, 1 in Iraq, came back, thank God, alive. And I take care of his children now. I've been their primary caregiver for the last 12 years, along with my wife. And I just want to say this, my favorite photograph in my house, and this does have a bearing on what we're talking about, is John standing in front of a girls' school in Afghanistan that had just opened on his own time, rotating with other Marines who were defending this school against Taliban attacks that were being made in the name of Islam. And I just want to tell my fellow Americans that as the proud father of a U.S. Marine who defended the right of little girls to get an education with his body, willing to risk his life to do that on his own time when he was out of Bagram Air Base, that if they think it is a good path to have people in our culture who want to use religion in order to govern instead of democratic forms of government, that somehow the Bible takes precedence. I want to tell you this. We have an example of this. It's called the Taliban. It's called the Wahhabist rulers of Saudi Arabia. It is called the Hindu nationalists who attack Muslims and Christians in India now in the name of Hindu nationalism. This is a worldwide phenomenon. It's not just American evangelicals, black, white, brown, whomever. It is a competition between an idea of democracy and fairness for everyone, including women or people who aren't Christians or aren't Hindus if you're in India or aren't Muslims if you're governed by the Taliban. And so having had a son who got shot at for the United States of America and came back safe, and now I'm taking care of my grandchildren, his kids, knowing that he put his life at risk to defend the right of a child to get an education who's a female. To think that there are people in America who think that the religion is a good substitute for constitutional government is really heartbreaking to me, because I stayed up nights waiting for satellite calls from a young man who was ready to put his body on the line. And, you know, it's the reason I've spent the last 5 years writing this new book we mentioned at the beginning, Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy. And I talk about taking care of these grandchildren. And I talk about the fake family values we on the religious right were selling in the 70s and 80s that got folded into this whole new Christian nationalist movement in its new form, although Amanda's right, of course, it goes back further than this time. And our family was part of that. So fake family values are not real family values when they're oppressing women, when they're oppressing children, say with the Taliban, all in the name of religion. Religion is not a good substitute for democracy. That's all I want to say. And I'm sorry I went on a bit at length, but it just deeply, 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 deeply troubles me on a very personal level.
There's a question from Victor. He says, I don't know if this is a question that has been asked. He said, but how do we break this fever?
Well, I mean, I think I got at it a little bit. And I mean, Frank, thank you. That was just a beautiful story. And you know, what I wanted, before I go to that, I mean, I want to say, in addition to, you know, why we would want to firmly reject a kind of theocracy or religious nationalism as a way to govern our country, but also the people who would probably question your patriotism, Frank, because of some of the stances that you take on issues, right, that are at odds with this, you know, kind of list of identity factors that go with Christian nationalism, and you know, how patriotic both you and your son were to have that service and to have that story. Like, patriotism is much bigger than this small slice that would be interpreted through this lens of Christian nationalism. But I think breaking the fever, you know, is it's going to be a long haul. You know, as deeply entrenched as Christian nationalism is in our society, I totally agree this is a worldwide phenomenon. I think American Christian nationalism has some unique aspects to it, particularly because of our history of racism and slavery, but and other kinds of domination and discovery doctrine and all of those things that are all wrapped up into the ideology. But it's going to take a concerted effort from a lot of different points. And so, you know, Christians against Christian nationalism is one way to get at that. We really felt like it was the job of Christians to understand Christian nationalism and to think about this not just for our neighbors, but also for our own faith and what that takes. But there are also, you know, the impacts this has on religious minorities, including the growing number of Americans who don't affiliate as religious at all, you know, and how that excludes and discriminates against them. You know, I think we're all have our role to play to, again, understand it, recognize it, call it out, choose something different, you know, and in our religious language, we can choose Christianity over Christian nationalism, but in our civic language, we can choose, you know, the better path of a religious freedom for all, a government that stays neutral when it comes to religion. That's the form of government that our founders set up for us, and there's no reason for us to reject that in favor of a religious nationalism that has torn the world apart in many different areas by war.
And religion is only mentioned, Amanda, you say this in some of your presentations, only mentioned one time in the Constitution, and it says that there should be no religious test for office.
For public office.
Office.
I say that's, you know, I often say people who say the founders set up the U.S. as a Christian nation, I said they weren't very effective if the only time they mentioned religion in the Constitution was, first of all, not saying Christianity at all, but to say there would be no religious tests for public office. They debated this topic and they deliberately chose a neutral government. And that should be all the evidence we need that this wasn't set up to favor Christians. Now, in practice, again, because of Christian nationalism, we've seen an enormous amount of Christian privilege and Christian preferentialism that have happened, and that I think we need to guard against.
One last statement, and it's a question and a statement. Do you hear a lot, I know I do in the circles, and I'm sure you do, that America is losing America. We're losing our identity as a country. Yeah, we may not have been set up as a Christian nation, but that was the idea, and that was the ideal. And it speaks to the pushback against immigration. It speaks to what we're seeing down here in Texas at the border. Instead of, we're calling it, on the right, calling it an invasion and all of those kinds of things. But are we losing as a country our identity?
What do you think, Amanda?
Well, no, I don't. And I mean, when you say those words, Dorothy, there's actually some polling in an article out just this week that talks about, some of that is called the Great Replacement Theory. And it's something that has very long and deep racist roots. And so appealing to that idea has become more and more, I think, front and center, and something that is very connected to Christian nationalism. I think our roots are actually much more religiously diverse and pluralistic, even at the time of our founding, than is often acknowledged. And that was, to the extent that that it was still, of course, I think, Christian majority, as it continues to be now. At least people claim a Christian identity. A majority of Americans still do in some way. But it is also, the United States is incredibly religiously diverse. And I think that is our American identity, is religious pluralism in a country where we should be free to practice or not practice any religion we choose. So it's that identity that I'm afraid of losing to Christian nationalism.
Yeah, I want to go further and say there's such a thing as an American identity, and I'm really sorry to keep harping on this, but I am the proud father of a Marine. Listen, when my son, that war was lost from the beginning. I'm not talking about the politics or who I voted for, but I was proud that my son served. He stood up when a lot of people didn't. Very few of his friends were going in and doing anything. And I just want to say this, and it has to be said when we're talking about nationalism and Christian nationalism or religious nationalism of any kind. When he stood guarding that girl's school against people who wanted to kill the girls and the teacher, because in their version of Islam, which is not Islam, it's their radical version of Islam, the Taliban believe women should not be educated. They were ready to have a religious nationalism preclude that. When he put his body, his American young Marine body, in the way of the people who wanted to kill those students, because even as a young man at 19, he believed that they had a right to be there, he was exercising what I'll call something different, and that is American democratic nationalism. The beliefs of this country that everyone should have a shot, including a little girl in a country where your religion says you shouldn't get an education or one religious group did. So to me, the best part of America, the part I'm most proud of, is those times when we break away from our nationalism of any kind, especially a religious nationalism that gets in the way of our democracy, and instead embrace this idea that we are for a higher set of values that don't depend on your color, who you worship, how you were educated, your zip code. When we're at our best, that's who we are. And when we're at our worst, we're not. And it boggles my mind that there are evangelical Christians out there who would rather turn America into a Christian version of Iran or a Christian version of the Taliban. This is a horror show. Everything we hold dear, and that includes the right wing, that includes all of us. Our better natures are always expressed in the idea that what this country represents, and when at its best, having fallen short a lot, but at its best, is the idea that we are not judged by some parameter other than we are a citizen with full rights. That's it. And when we go against that in the name of God or Christianity or left-wing politics or right-wing politics or feminism or anti-feminism. It doesn't matter what. When we start redefining ourselves by these other monikers, we're no longer upholding what makes this country great and has in the past. And so it really is a tragedy to see religious nationalism or Christian nationalism replacing democracy in this country when we have these horrific examples around the world showing us where that path leads. It's insanity. I just, really feel strongly about this.
We do.
Well, and I'm sorry, Dorothy.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, also, I mean, it's a tragedy. It's a horror show, not just for what it means for the country, but what it means for our faith. Your example there about, how it's an extreme form of Islam, I agree. And just like Christian nationalism has so distorted what Christianity even looks like, right? Yes. And what impact that has on our personal faith journeys, but also on what people think about Christianity in the greater culture as well. And, we can point to the way that, again, for centuries, the Bible was used to justify slavery. Here's a way that power and government used our religion to justify a political end. And what was harmed, in addition to the lives of millions of people, was the faith itself, and the way that changed Christianity, forever, and how hard that is to reclaim. And so I think that we always, when we're talking about this as Christians, we always have to talk about, the impact that this has on our country and on our faith.
And we're seeing the numbers. The numbers are going down. I think it was back in, Amanda, you had the numbers in the 90s. I think it was like, it used to be 90% or 70% of people identified as Christians, but today that number has gone significantly down. I don't know what the numbers are, but you said it once at some point.
Well, I point to the pollsters at PRRI. Do a lot of really good polling, and Robert P. Jones leads that organization. They do a lot of polling on religion and religious practice, and so they've documented, the impact that this has on how many people want to be associated with Christianity.
So it's going to
take...
and
I sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, I would just add to that I think that going back to that other point that I made earlier, when I talked about fake family values as opposed to real family values, there's such hypocrisy here. Our fake family values say to women in Texas, we're going to rat you out if you go to an abortion clinic. Real family values would say, why are we giving people no real choices? Who's here to help somebody that wants to keep a child? Where is the program that pays for a safe, good medical care and a delivery? Where is the educational system? Where is the job training for a single mom working 3 low-paid jobs? Where are the things that would show you that you actually do care about children and babies, fetuses or otherwise? They aren't there. It's fake family values. And I think this kind of Christian nationalism or religious nationalism is a fake patriotism. It's an easy, cheap, fake patriotism that doesn't do the work my son did standing in front of a girls' school to guard it. It just gets all rah, let's send them over there. Yeah. He's a real patriot. Okay, whether you like the war or not, that's patriotism. It's fake patriotism to put a bumper sticker on your car. It's fake family values to say no abortions, but we're not going to lift a finger for your child. And so I just think there's such hypocrisy here to use religion in order to browbeat other people into conformity with one religious viewpoint in the name of patriotism and nationalism is about as real and about as authentic as some guy that puts a bumper sticker on his car or a flag or wears a flag pin, but where's his kid? He's not in Afghanistan getting shot at like mine was. So what I'm trying to say is there's a hypocrisy here. Fake family values, fake patriotism, fake nationalism. Real nationalism is to say, thank God we're living in the United States where a girl can go to school, whether her parents approve of it religiously or not. Thank God that you as a woman, Amanda, have rights here, whether my view of womanhood through my patriarchal inheritance as an evangelical allows you to or not. And up to this point, we haven't totally confused the two, but Christian nationalism is trying to confuse these things, and I just think it's horrible from the point of view of even our patriotic duty, let alone how do we remain Christians when everything is being done in the name of Christianity except practicing what Jesus actually taught us to do. Mm-hmm. That is the ultimate hypocrisy in my way of thinking. So, I don't know what more I would say on that, but I really feel so deeply about this, that we're being robbed of real patriotism, real family values, and real Christianity. And we have this fake version that is cheap, it's easy, it's nasty, and it ignores all the roots and the basis of constitutional law on one hand and actual Christianity as well. I mean, it's a real mess.
Frank Victor says, please tell Frank I've watched him on shows like The Readout, Lawrence O'Donnell. Tell him to keep telling people sooner or later they will start to listen. It's going to take Christians. It's going to more Christians are going to have to start speaking up. Conservative Christians like me, progressive Christians. As long as if we name the name of Jesus Christ, we are obligated to speak truth. We're obligated to speak truth, no matter what end of the spectrum that we're on. And today, it gave me, it's Christians in public service, we love people. We love all people. We love people. And today we made a connection between Frank and Amanda, and the work that both of you are doing in this country is tremendous. And you both now are connected, and I can't wait to see what this is going to be, because it's going to take people, bold people who are willing to speak up and say this is just not right, and not based on anything political, not based on all of the other stuff, but right is right and still wrong is wrong, and what we're seeing is a whole lot of wrong. So thank you too for being here. I absolutely have enjoyed. I visit. I just feel like we are brothers and sisters. We're connected across the country. We're connected across just all kind of different ways, but we have the same heart. And back to Victor's part, that's what it's going to take. It's going to take people of goodwill, people who understand that we all have been given a wonderful, beautiful country that's worth saving, and not just saving for some, but saving for all. And I'm all in with that. All in with that. So thank you both. Any last words?
Thank you.
Last words from you two?
Amanda, last word from you?
I just say join us. Join Christians Against Christian Nationalism if you haven't checked out our resources. And even if you don't identify as a Christian, there are resources there that I think will be helpful in working on this problem. But, I really appreciate your leadership, Dorothy, and your incredible contributions, Frank. It's been wonderful to be in conversation with you both today.
You guys.
Well, I feel the same. And Dorothy, I mentioned to you before we did this, and also to Amanda, that I want to flip this and have you both come and be guests, and let's all three be on at the same time, because we made a good thing here. Let's go do more of this, and next time we'll hear more from you, Dorothy, because I'm going to interview you guys on In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, my podcast. I invite you here, but I'm one of these guys that is good at inviting people on, and then I forget things. So Dorothy and Amanda, I beg you, please email me and say, yes, I'll be on your podcast, and then I'll send it to my producer, Ernie, and then it'll actually happen, because Ernie's brain works in other ways, like actually gets things done. So let's do this and have you on my podcast to continue the conversation.
And you guys be sure and pre-order Frank's book.
Thank you. Please do.
Please
I need
order
your
his
help.
book.
Help me, Obi-Wan. You're my only hope.
I will tell you, I told Frank before, this Crazy for God, I cannot put his book down. So I cannot wait to read his new book. So please order his book, pre-order it, and help him out. And we're just all here to help one another. Amanda, thank you. Frank, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Be well.